What if the most terrifying crimes don't happen in dark alleys, but in places we believe are safe? A quiet college town. 4 young lives, and one night that America will never forget. The Idaho College Murders are not just another crime story. They are a chilling mystery where silence became the strongest witness. In this documentary series, we separate facts from speculation, breaking down every critical moment, every overlooked detail, and every decision that led to one of the most shocking cases in modern U.S. history. Stay until the end, because the truth goes deeper than it appears. The night that changed Moscow forever. On a cold November night in 2022, the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho, went to sleep like it always had. Streets were calm. Lights glowed softly from student apartments. Nothing suggested that, within hours, this peaceful community would become the center of one of America's most haunting true crime cases. Moscow was not a city known for violence. It was a place defined by routine classes, football games, weekend parties, and familiar faces. Parents felt safe sending their children here. Students walked home late without fear. That sense of safety would soon disappear. At the heart of this story was a house near King Road, just minutes from the University of Idaho campus. It was a rental home shared by students young, social, and deeply connected to campus life. On the outside, it looked ordinary. Inside, it was full of laughter, friendships, and plans for the future. No one knew it would soon become a crime scene that shocked the entire nation. A normal Saturday night, November 12, 2022, was a typical Saturday. Students went out, celebrated the weekend, and enjoyed the freedom of college life. Social media posts showed smiling faces. Nothing appeared unusual. Later that night, the house on King Road grew quiet. Lights went out. The occupants settled in for sleep. What happened next would take years to understand, and some questions may never be fully answered. In the early morning hours of November 13th, something went terribly wrong. At first, no alarms were raised, no emergency calls, no reports of a disturbance. The night passed in silence. Then morning came. The discovery, just before noon, a 911 call was made. The caller reported an unconscious person at the house. The details were unclear. Confused voices, panic, fear. When police arrived, they expected a medical emergency. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. 4 University of Idaho students were found dead inside the home. The scene was immediately secured. Officers realized this was not an accident. It was not natural causes. It was something far more serious. The town of Moscow would never be the same again. Shockwaves across America. News spread rapidly. Within hours, the case dominated headlines across the United States. Parents of college students everywhere felt a sudden chill of fear. How could something like this happen in such a quiet town? Who could do this? And most importantly, why? Authorities confirmed that there was no sign of forced entry. There was no public suspect. No clear motive. The victims appeared to have been targeted inside their own home, a place where they should have felt safest. Rumors began immediately. Social media exploded with speculation. Armchair detectives analyzed every detail, every photo, every rumor. But facts were scarce. A community in fear. As days passed without an arrest, fear settled over Moscow. Students left town. Classes shifted online. Doors were locked earlier than ever before. Police increased patrols, but reassurance was difficult. Was the killer still out there? Authorities urged calm, but uncertainty remained. The idea that someone could enter a home unnoticed and vanish without a trace terrified the community. The case quickly became more than a local tragedy. It turned into a national mystery. The investigation begins. Investigators faced enormous pressure. The public demanded answers. The families demanded justice. Every move was scrutinized. Hundreds of tips flooded in from across the country. Detectives worked around the clock. Forensic teams processed the house carefully, knowing that a single mistake could compromise the entire case. But law enforcement remained cautious with public statements. They released very little information, and that silence only deepened the mystery. Online theories and speculation as official details stayed limited. Online speculation filled the gap. Some believed the crime was random. Others believed it was personal. Names were thrown around recklessly. Innocent people found themselves accused online, their lives disrupted by rumors. Police warned the public repeatedly. Speculation could harm the investigation. Still, the internet continued to search for answers. A case without a face. Weeks passed, there was still no suspect announced. No arrest. No clear explanation. For many, this was the most frightening part. Crimes feel safer when they are solved, when there is a name, a face, a motive. Here, there was none. The killer or killers seemed to have disappeared into the night. The pressure mounts. Behind the scenes, investigators expanded their focus. Digital data, surveillance footage, cell phone records, vehicle movements. Every possible angle was examined, but law enforcement remained disciplined. They revealed nothing prematurely. This restraint frustrated the public, but it was intentional, because somewhere within the silence, a plan was forming. The calm before the break. By December, many began to fear the case might go cold. Then, quietly, something changed. Investigators shifted direction. New information emerged, still not public but enough to suggest the case was far from over. The hunt had entered a new phase, and the person at the center of it all had no idea how close the spotlight was about to get. The murders had shaken a nation. The town was frozen in fear, and the investigation was moving silently toward a breakthrough. But who was watching from the shadows? Who had left no trace? And how did police finally narrow in on a suspect when the case seemed impossible to solve? The silent clues no one noticed. In the weeks following the murders, Moscow, Idaho existed in a strange state of fear and disbelief. The initial shock had faded, but the questions remained louder than ever. Who could commit such a crime and disappear without a trace? Behind closed doors, investigators were no longer reacting. They were building something carefully, quietly, and strategically. Because even the most carefully planned crime leaves something behind. A crime scene that spoke in silence. The house on King Road was more than just a location. To investigators, it was a story frozen in time. Every detail mattered. Every absence mattered even more. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. No public signs of struggle outside the home. This suggested something deeply unsettling. The killer may not have needed to break in. That possibility shifted the entire investigation. If entry was easy, then access mattered. Familiarity mattered. And time mattered, narrowing the timeline. One of the first major challenges was establishing a precise timeline. Investigators worked backward, analyzing phone records, digital activity, and known movements. They reconstructed the victim's final hours, not to invade privacy, but to understand opportunity. What stood out was the narrow window in which the crime occurred. That window would become critical, because it meant the killer had to move quickly, quietly, and confidently. The digital trail in modern investigations, silence is rare. Phones, ping towers, cameras record movement, apps log activity. Cars leave data trails. Even when people think they are invisible, technology remembers. Investigators began reviewing thousands of hours of surveillance footage from gas stations, apartment complexes, businesses, and traffic cameras. Most of it showed nothing, but nothing, when repeated enough times, becomes something. A vehicle appears as footage was reviewed frame by frame. One detail kept appearing in the background: a white sedan. It didn't race. It didn't draw attention. It simply appeared late at night, near the area. Then Bunny said, at first, it meant nothing. Then it appeared again, and again. The vehicle wasn't identified publicly at the time, but internally it became a focus. Not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't belong. Why the car mattered. The streets around King Road were quiet. Traffic was limited. Patterns were predictable. The white sedan disrupted that pattern. It seemed to circle, to pause, to move with purpose. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions. They logged Italiano, compared timestamps, cross-checked camera angles. The car wasn't proof, but it was a question. Behavioral analysis begins. At the same time, behavioral analysts were brought in. They examined the nature of the crime, not to sensationalize it, but to understand intent. What kind of person plans something like this? What level of risk were they willing to take? The answers suggested someone who was calm under pressure, someone who believed they could control the situation, someone confident enough to think they wouldn't be caught. Public silence, private pressure to the public. It looked like nothing was happening. To investigators, everything was happening. They intentionally released very little information. This wasn't negligence, it was strategy. They were watching reactions. Because when people feel safe, they relax. And when they relax, they make mistakes. A shift in focus. By early December, the investigation quietly shifted from what happened to who fits this pattern. They weren't looking for a monster. They were looking for someone ordinary. Someone who blended in. Someone who didn't panic when the news broke. Data starts to align. Cell phone data became a powerful tool. Not content location. Which phones were near the house during the critical window? Which devices appeared repeatedly near the area at odd hours? One data pattern stood out. A phone that seemed to move with intention, near but not inside the crime scene area. Then gone. Then back again on other nights. This wasn't proof. But it wasn't coincidence either. The waiting game. Investigators did not move quickly. They gathered more data. Compared it. Verified it, challenged their own assumptions. Because in a case this public, one mistake could destroy everything. They knew that when they made a move, it had to be the right one. The public grows restless. Meanwhile, the internet grew louder. People demanded arrests, demanded answers. But law enforcement stayed silent. Because they were closer than anyone realized. A name enters the picture somewhere between thousands of data points. A profile began to form. Not a suspect yet. A possibility. A person whose movements, habits, and presence raised quiet questions. A person who, on the surface, appeared unremarkable. But beneath that surface, something didn't fit. And investigators noticed the calm before exposure. By mid-December, surveillance intensified. The focus narrowed. The investigation had direction now. And the person at the center of it continued living their life unaware that every step was being mapped, every movement logged, every assumption tested. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was preparation. The clues were no longer scattered. They were aligning. A vehicle, a phone, a pattern of behavior. And for the first time since the murders, investigators believed they were no longer chasing shadows. They were closing in. A trail that crossed state lines. By mid-December, investigators were no longer looking blindly. The case had direction. What began as scattered clues was now forming a path, one that quietly extended far beyond Moscow. Idaho, the investigation had entered its most delicate phase. Because now, it wasn't just about evidence. It was about timing. A pattern beyond one night. As analysts reviewed weeks of data, one realization became impossible to ignore. The movement patterns they were tracking did not begin on the night of the murders. They appeared earlier. And they continued afterward. This suggested planning, not impulse. Whatever happened on November 13th was not isolated. It was part of a larger behavioral timeline, one that stretched across locations and days. Expanding the search radius, investigators expanded their geographic focus. Surveillance data from nearby towns was pulled. Then nearby counties. Then neighboring states. This wasn't guesswork. It was mathematics. If a vehicle or device disappeared from one area, it had to appear somewhere else. And eventuality. Did a quiet life, a growing focus. As data aligned, attention narrowed to a single individual whose movements repeatedly intersected with key locations. On the surface, there was nothing alarming. No criminal history that screamed danger. No public behavior that raised immediate red flags. That made the situation more complicated, because the most unsettling suspects are often the least visible. Academic interest meets real-world crime. What made this case especially unsettling was the background context investigators began to assemble. The individual they were quietly tracking had a deep academic interest in criminal behavior. This wasn't a rumor. It was documented. They had studied criminology, analyzing how crimes happen, how criminals think, and how investigations unfold. 2 detectives? This raised an uncomfortable question. Was this knowledge purely academic? Or something more? Surveillance without disturbance, law enforcement did not confront. Tayob surveyed. The goal was not to alert but to confirm. Agents followed movements carefully. Locations were noted. Habits were logged. Behavior was compared against known data points. Every action had to be defensible. Because once a suspect becomes aware, everything changes. The importance of restraint in high-profile cases. Pressure can force mistakes. Investigators refused to rush. They knew the public was watching. They also knew that evidence gathered too quickly or improperly could collapse under legal scrutiny. So they waited and watched. Crossing borders, the trail eventually led investigators across state lines. This was no longer a local case. It had become a coordinated, multi-agency effort. Surveillance increased. Digital records were analyzed with greater precision. Historical movement data was re-examined with fresh perspective. The picture was becoming clearer. The weight of circumstantial evidence. It's important to understand something critical. At this stage, there was no single piece of evidence that told the entire story. What existed was alignment. Behavior matched timing. Movement matched opportunity. Data matched presence. In criminal investigations, alignment is powerful. The role of forensics behind the scenes, forensic analysis, continued quietly. Every process was double-checked. Nothing was assumed, because forensics does not confirm theories. It tests. Then, and only when results survive scrutiny do they become evidence, a life unaware of the spotlight. Meanwhile, the individual at the center of this growing focus continued daily life. Classes, travel, routine, no visible panic, no public breakdown. This calmness was noted not as guilt, but as behavior. Investigators do not judge emotion. They document it. While silence was strategic, the public remained frustrated. But silence protected the case. By withholding information, investigators ensured that no one could alter behavior based on what they knew. The suspect remained unalerted, and that mattered more than headlines. Preparing for the moment, and by late December, investigators believed they had reached a threshold. Enough alignment, enough confirmation, enough confidence to move forward. But they still did not act, because when they did, there would be no turning back. Arrests in cases like this must be precise. Irreversible. The final checks. Legal teams reviewed every step. Every warrant application was challenged internally. Every assumption was tested. The goal was simple. When the public finally heard a name, it would stand. No gaps, no shortcuts. A nation about to learn the name as the year came to an end. The investigation reached its quiet climax. What had begun in a small college town was now positioned to become a national moment. One step away. One announcement away. One decision away. The pieces were finally in place. The data had spoken. The trail had been followed, and investigators were ready to act. But how would the arrest unfold? What evidence would support it? And how would the nation react when the suspect was finally named? The arrest that shocked America in the early hours of a cold December morning. Silence once again played a role in this case. But this time, the silence came before a storm. Far from Moscow, Idaho, hundreds of miles away, law enforcement prepared to make a move that would change the course of the investigation forever. A carefully chosen moment. The arrest was not rushed. It was planned. With precision, investigators chose a time when risk would be minimal, evidence secure, and the element of surprise complete. This wasn't just about taking someone into custody. It was about protecting the integrity of the case. The arrest in the early morning hours. Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody at a residence in Pennsylvania. There was no dramatic chase, no public confrontation. Just a quiet knock, followed by a moment that instantly became national news. After weeks of speculation, fear, and unanswered questions, authorities finally had a suspect. News breaks nationwide. When the news broke, it spread instantly. Television networks interrupted programming. Phones buzzed with alerts. Social media erupted. The question everyone had been asking for weeks: do they have someone? Finally had an answer. Yes. A name the nation would remember: Bryan Kohberger. Until that moment, the name meant nothing to most people. Within hours, it was everywhere. Headlines, discussions, debates. Who was he? How was he connected? And most importantly, the charges are announced. Authorities confirmed that Kohberger was charged in connection with the murders. They were careful with their language. They emphasized that an arrest is not a conviction, that due process matters. But they also made it clear this was not a random decision. This was the result of weeks of investigation, coordination, and evidence review. The public reacts. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some felt relief. Others felt disbelief. Many felt fear because the suspect did not fit the image people expected. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He appeared ordinary, and that made the case even more unsettling. The internet goes into overdrive as soon as the arrest was announced. Online communities exploded. People searched for connections, analyzed photos, revisited old theories. Some celebrated the arrest. Others demanded transparency. The case became more than an investigation. It became a national conversation. Law enforcement stays cautious despite the attention. Authorities remain disciplined. They released limited information. They avoided speculation, because from this moment forward, every word mattered. Anything said publicly could impact the trial. Extradition and legal process. After the arrest, the legal process moved carefully. Extradition procedures began. Court appearances were scheduled. The case transitioned from investigation to prosecution. A new phase had begun. Families await answers for the families of the victims. The arrest brought mixed emotions. Relief that progress had been made. Pain that no arrest could undo what was lost. And uncertainty because the legal journey was far from over. Justice is not instant. It is deliberate. A case far from finished. While many believed the arrest marked the end, investigators knew better. An arrest is a beginning. Evidence still had to be presented. Arguments still had to be made. Truth still had to be tested in court. The weight of expectation. The nation now expected answers. How was the suspect identified? What evidence led to this moment? Why did it take weeks? Investigators understood this pressure, but they refused to trade clarity for speed. Silence returns for now. After the headlines faded, silence returned once again. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of preparation, because the most important phase of this case was still ahead. Evidence, questions, and the search for justice. With the arrest complete, the story did not end. In many ways, it was only beginning. The investigation that had unfolded quietly in the shadows now moved into the brightest possible spotlight, a courtroom. And with it came the most difficult challenge of all: turning suspicion into proof. From investigation to prosecution, once the suspect was in custody, the responsibility shifted. Investigators had built the case. Now, prosecutors had to present it. Every detail would be questioned, every conclusion challenged. Because in the justice system, certainty is not enough. It must be proven. Understanding the evidence carefully, authorities outlined that their case was built on a combination of forensic analysis, digital data, and behavioral patterns. No single piece stood alone. Instead, the strength of the case came from how the pieces aligned. This approach is common in complex investigations, especially when the crime itself leaves limited direct witnesses. The role of forensic analysis. Forensic work focused on what could be scientifically verified. This included material collected from relevant locations, analyzed using established laboratory methods. Experts emphasized that forensic evidence is not about theories. It is about results that can be tested, challenged, and confirmed. And that process takes time. Digital footprints revisited, Digital data played a central role, not content but movement. Cell phone records, location patterns, timing, correlations. Prosecutors argued that these patterns supported a narrative of presence and opportunity. The defense, however, prepared to question interpretation, because data does not speak on its own. Humans interpret it. A courtroom built on process. As the legal process moved forward, the court emphasized one critical principle: presumption of innocence. This is not a formality. It is the foundation of justice. The case would not be decided by headlines or public opinion. It would be decided by evidence, arguments, and law. Public opinion versus legal reality outside the courtroom. Opinions were already formed. Some believed the arrest brought closure. Others believed questions remained unanswered. This divide was expected. High-profile cases rarely offer simple conclusions. They expose how differently people interpret truth, fear, and justice. The family's perspective. For the families of the victims, the courtroom was not about debate. It was about answers, about accountability, about understanding how something so devastating could happen so quietly. No legal outcome could restore what was lost, but clarity mattered. The defense strategy, the defense signaled its intent to challenge assumptions, to question timelines, to examine how conclusions were drawn. This is not obstruction. It is how the system ensures fairness. Justice must survive scrutiny. Or it is not justice at all. Why this case feels different, what made this case resonate so deeply, was not just the crime. It was the contrast. A quiet town, young lives full of potential, a crime that shattered the illusion of safety, and a suspect who did not fit familiar stereotypes. It forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. Danger does not always announce itself. The unanswered questions, even with an arrest and charges, questions remain. Why this location? Why this timing? Was it planned far in advance, or did circumstances align? Some answers may come in court. Others may never be fully known, and that uncertainty is difficult but real. The role of time, justice, moves slowly for a reason. Rushing risks mistakes, and mistakes in cases like this have consequences that last forever. Time allows facts to be tested, stories to be verified, and truth to emerge without pressure. The community changed forever regardless of the final verdict. Moscow, Idaho will never be the same. Neither will the families. Neither will the students who once believed their town was immune to this kind of tragedy. The case has already left its mark. What justice truly means. Justice is not revenge. It is responsibility. It is accuracy. It is the courage to wait for the right answer even when emotions demand speed. That is the standard this case must meet. The final reflection. This story began in silence. It moved through fear, speculation, and questions. It now stands in a place where truth must be proven, not assumed, and that matters, because the outcome will echo far beyond one courtroom. The Idaho College Murders case reminds us that behind every headline are real people, real loss, and real consequences. It challenges us to respect process, to separate emotion from evidence, and to remember that justice is not a moment, it is a journey. As this case continues through the legal system, new developments may emerge, new details may surface, and new questions may be answered. This story was never just about an arrest. It was about unanswered questions, broken trust, and a search for justice that continues long after the headlines fade. When the cameras turn off, families are still waiting, communities are still healing, and the truth is still being tested. If you want thoughtful, respectful, and deeply researched true crime documentaries, subscribe to the channel, like the video to support responsible storytelling. And comment below, do you believe all the answers are known? Or is there still more beneath the surface?